Hallowford lay low in a wet valley where hedges were cut like rules and the air tasted of stone. The Kindred estate rose from the damp orchard rose exact, brass bright, doors scrubbed, the kind of place people trusted because nothing was out of line. For generations, the Kindreds hosted the harvest, paid for the church roof, and sent baskets to widows. Yet everyone knew the pattern they refused to name. Every Kindred boy died by 12. Births drew casseroles in quiet dread. Girls learned to carry the talk, saying it was weakness in the blood. Boys learned not to ask why their birthdays felt like doors. The vicar's ledger spoke of fevers without rash, falls without bruises, lungs that failed without struggle. The same steady handwriting causes that made grief look like weather. In the Kindred house, sorrow wore a tidy uniform. Silver held thin reflections, linen smelled of lye, and the east stair was known but never discussed. It led to a wing that smelled of soap and apples, clean in a way that felt like erasing. The women moved like nurses, sleeves pinned, hair tied, voices low, and the village loved them for their care. They said drafts were dangerous, that sleep must be guarded, that lamps should be turned down at 9. Baths were drawn warm, then cool, then warm again, as if the body were a metal to be tempered. A prayer was said at the door of the unused nursery, kept ready to prove hope lived there. Kindness covered everything like a cloth, and under it the shape of something sharp hid in plain sight. A curse is a comfort when the curse bakes your bread. So the village took pies, borrowed tools, praised the clipped hedges, and looked away from patterns too neat to be chance. Children on the lane could chant the years of the little graves without knowing they were counting coffins. By custom, boys in their 12th year were kept close, no river, no ladders, no mill, and the rule was explained as care. It felt like love because it was gentle, but order has a taste when it is used as a blade. Order hung on a pantry hook in charts of small, careful writing that tracked sleep, weight, breath, behavior, always in the same clear female hand. The order lined the orchard rows with the windows of the east wing so a watcher could count trees like hours. Order matched the bell of the church to certain tasks, so the lane heard only worship while something private moved room to room. The parish told itself stories. Some said the valley air was bad for boys. Some said the Kindreds were paying for an old sin. Some said boys wandered and girls stayed, and fate found the ones who ran. These stories kept fear polite and made grief look inevitable. Meanwhile, the eldest daughter led the hospital fund, sat by sickbeds, and watched the color of lips after sleep and the way a pulse slowed when a room cooled. She called this care, and people believed she had a special gift, and they gave the family more trust than any law could ask. An inspector came in spring, saw clean wells and good works, and wrote heredity and damp. The report helped people sleep, but the dates on the stones formed one stepped line. The boys who lived longest had mothers with the strictest ledgers, and the lack of bruises proved only skill. Inside the house, a belief hardened. To keep the family pure, men must not be allowed to grow. It was said nowhere and practiced everywhere in secret processes that wore the mask of care. The mothers did not see cruelty. They saw a garden that needed pruning before blight. They smiled in church, passed the plate, listened to others' worries, and went home to check the chart. The east stair held the rest. The parish, eager to be kind, stayed eager to be blind. Fog pressed low over hedges trimmed to the inch. A boy ran in the yard happy, unaware that a seat at the table had already been set for his next birthday, and that the house, patient as ever, was ready to receive him. In the pantry sat small brown bottles labeled in a neat hand, a scale polished from use, and a stack of folded cloth stitched with initials. These were tools of care and tools of something else depending on who held them close. The winter of 1782 lay heavy on Hallowford. the kind that pressed frost into the seams of windows and made breath look like smoke. Inside the Kindred estate, the rooms were warm, but not from any joy. Peter Kindred woke up that morning thinking it was the best day of his life. 12 years old, bright-eyed, eager for the gifts and sugared bread promised to him. He did not notice that his mother, Margaret, moved through the house with a quiet focus, as if each step had been measured before she took it. She had dressed him herself, smoothing his hair, fastening his collar, her hands lingering not in affection but in appraisal, as if she were ensuring that everything was in its rightful place. The whispers he had heard in the days before, hushed voices that stopped when he entered the room, meant nothing to him. He believed the strange glances were the watchful care of a loving family. Margaret spoke of a blessing that every Kindred boy received on his 12th birthday. She told him it was a tradition older than the manor, older than the orchard outside, something sacred and necessary to carry him safely into manhood. The words sounded warm, but her eyes carried none of the softness her tone suggested. After breakfast, she led him into the dining hall, locking the door behind them with a key she kept on a chain at her waist. The long table had been cleared except for a single chair set at the far end, a white cloth folded neatly on the seat. The shutters were drawn tight, trapping the air so still that Peter could hear the clock in the hall ticking beyond the door. She asked him to sit, telling him it was important not to speak during the blessing. From a cabinet against the wall, she brought a tray covered in a linen cloth. Beneath it lay a small glass cup, its contents the pale, chalky color of powdered bone, stirred into milk until it swirled in slow, ghostly ribbons. She set it before him with the same careful movements she used when serving guests, but her hands gripped the tray longer than necessary, as though bracing for the weight of what she was about to do. She murmured phrases in a low voice, not in prayer but in some private recitation, a pattern of sounds learned by heart. Peter sipped because she told him it would make him strong. The taste was bitter and earthy like damp soil, but she watched until the cup was empty, her expression unreadable. When it was done, she placed her hands lightly on his shoulders and held them there, her thumbs pressing the base of his neck in slow, steady pulses. His breathing quickened, then slowed, as though the air had thickened. His gaze found the candle on the table, but the flame began to swim in his vision. Margaret did not move away. She stayed behind him, murmuring the same strange syllables until his head grew heavy and his chest no longer rose. Only then did she step back, smoothing the folds of his shirt and wiping the corner of his mouth with the edge of the white cloth. By the time the coroner arrived that afternoon, the body had been arranged upright in the chair, hands folded in his lap as if caught in a moment of prayer. His eyes, still open, reflected the candlelight in a way that made them seem almost glass. The smear of powder at his mouth was small enough to ignore, small enough to explain away as some residue from an herbal remedy for fever. The coroner, a man who had seen his share of strange endings, took one long look at Margaret and did not ask questions. Fever was easy to write, easy to believe, especially for a boy whose 12th birthday had long been expected to be his last. The coffin was ordered closed before the village could gather. No one but the family saw him lowered into the earth. Those who came to the wake were greeted with warm bread and gentle words, reassured that the kindred curse had claimed another, but that it was God's will. In the days that followed, Margaret kept to her routines, her face calm, her posture precise, her voice steady when offering condolences for her own loss. In her mind, the act was not murder but preservation, the final necessary step in a tradition that had been carried out for as long as she could remember. The orchard stood silent under frost, its branches bare. Yet it seemed to watch the house as if it knew the pattern would begin again when the next boy was born. The parish archives in Hallowford were not grand, only a cramped stone room beneath the church vestry, its shelves sagging under the weight of centuries. In the cold light of late afternoon, the handwriting of long-dead clerks told a story they likely never intended to preserve. The same surname repeated down the brittle pages matched with the same cruel number. 12. Always a boy. Always the same year of his life, and always entered into the record with a bland cause of death that asked no questions. The ink softened over time, yet the pattern cut sharper than any rumor. Lung sickness, fall from horse, fevered fit, phrases designed to dull grief to keep the community calm. But the pace was too neat, the tragedies too punctual, as though death itself worked from a family calendar. No gaps, no accidents outside the season. The family ledgers told even more. Their bindings heavier, their margins filled with small, deliberate marks. Each entry recorded the birth of a boy alongside the hour, the weather, the weight, and an unchanging column left blank until his 12th year. There, in the same steady script, appeared the date of his death, the cause copied from the parish register, and beside it a symbol. Different each time, yet drawn with the care of someone for whom meaning mattered. A small bird with clipped wings. A jar with something coiled inside, a key turned upside down. At first glance, these marks seemed harmless, decorative even, but seen together they formed a private language, the vocabulary of a tradition no outsider was meant to understand. The speed of each burial was another constant. The boy's body would be lowered into the ground within hours of the death. The coffin lid nailed shut before the village could gather. There were no public viewings. No time for neighbors to visit the home and see the child's face one last time. The church bell would toll in the same measured pattern, and the women of the family, mothers, aunts, grandmothers, would stand together at the graveside, dry-eyed, dressed in unadorned black. Their composure was explained away as strength, but it was the stillness of people who already knew the ending long before it arrived. The clergy never spoke of autopsies, though some of the deaths, even by the lax standards of the age, begged for examination. A 12-year-old thrown from a horse in a pasture where no hoof prints were found. A boy is said to have drowned, though his clothes were dry and his lungs untouched by water. Another claimed fever despite a body cold to the touch at dawn. These contradictions never reached beyond whispers in the village. The Kindreds were patrons of the parish, their coin repairing the roof, buying the hymnals, keeping the vicar's fire lit in winter. Gratitude made a poor soil for suspicion to grow. Through every decade the pattern held, each generation of women outliving their men and inheriting both the estate and the authority to maintain it. They managed the orchards, the tenant farms, the accounts with the precision of stewards serving something greater than themselves. Visitors described them as composed and capable, if a little private. They never married outside certain circles, never left the valley for more than a few weeks, and seemed bound by an unspoken oath to one another. New brides learned quickly which rooms of the manor were theirs to tend and which were locked for reasons not explained. To the outside world, these women were the spine of the family, the ones who kept the Kindreds solvent through bad harvests and hard winters. But inside their walls, control extended beyond land and ledger. It reached into the lives they decided would continue and the ones they decided would end. The records made this clear in ways words could not. Each death a point on a line drawn unbroken for centuries. Each point marked by the same hand that signed the accounts, authorized the trades, and hosted the feasts where they smiled and served food with steady hands. It was a pattern too precise to be the work of chance or curse. It was the work of planning, carried out so smoothly that even those who might have suspected dared not say so. The parish records did not tremble. They did not accuse. They simply told the truth to anyone willing to read slowly enough to see it. And for the Kindred women, that truth was the foundation they stood on, unshakable as they looked to the next birth, the next son, the next date already waiting to be written in the blank space beside his name. In the spring of 1811, the air in Hallowford seemed lighter, as if the valley itself had loosened a long-held breath. Thomas Kindred had turned 12 in January and still walked among them, smiling, running errands, even playing near the churchyard where so many of his bloodline lay. The villagers, who had grown used to marking each Kindred boy's birthday as a countdown to burial, began to speak of him as proof that the curse had weakened. Women whispered that perhaps new generations were free from it, that God had lifted a hand that had pressed on the family for centuries. Even the vicar preached a sermon on deliverance, though his eyes stayed fixed on the women seated in the front pew as if seeking permission to hope. Inside the Kindred manor, however, the mood had not shifted. Doors still closed softly behind him. His meals were still set before him by the same gloved hands. His bed was still turned down each night with the same precise fold in the blanket, the same candle burning low in the hallway. The quiet observation of his every move had not stopped, though it was now disguised as careful attention, the kind reserved for something fragile that must be handled without cracks. It was in April, before the sun rose, that a farmhand named Peter Brooks first saw him. Thomas emerged from the orchard's far edge, moving without purpose, his bare feet black with mud, his nightshirt soaked as if he had walked through shallow water. His head turned slowly from side to side, eyes glassy, unblinking against the pale dawn. Peter ran to him, calling his name, but the boy did not answer. As the farmhand drew closer, he saw that Thomas's lips had been stitched shut, each puncture dark and swollen, the rough horsehair thread pulled tight enough to pucker the skin. His hands hung at his sides, fingers curling inwards, nails gone entirely from both hands, the raw tips seeping thin lines of blood. The smell reached Peter before he could touch him. A bitter, caustic reek of lies so strong it clung to the air, catching in the throat. Thomas stumbled when Peter tried to guide him forward, his legs giving way in the grass. His breathing came in shallow bursts, each one whistling faintly through the sealed mouth, and the farmhand realized he was making faint, choking noises from deep in his throat. When they reached the manor, the women met them at the door. They did not gasp or cry out, but moved as if they had been waiting for this moment. Thomas was taken from Peter's arms without thanks, carried up the east stair, and out of sight. Hours later, the news spread that he had died from shock and blood loss. There was no talk of a doctor being called. The death was written in the parish register as an unfortunate accident, and no one outside the family ever saw the body again. The orchard became a place people avoided after that, its neat rows holding a quiet menace that no one wanted to name. The lye smell had clung to Thomas's skin so strongly that those who had touched him swore they could still taste it on their fingers days later. In whispers, the older villagers spoke of lye as a cleanser, a thing used to strip away filth or dissolve the soft parts of what one wished gone. They could not reconcile its presence on a boy whose only crime was surviving longer than expected. The stitching was worse, a brutal, deliberate act that served no purpose but to silence. In the minds of those who dared think on it, the image of those black threads biting into a child's lips became something they could not set aside. The family buried him within a day, the coffin sealed, the grave marked with a modest stone that gave no hint of what had been done. In public, the Kindred women received condolences with grace, their black veils drawn low, their hands cool and steady as they accepted the touch of neighbors. In private, their ledgers remained as meticulous as ever. The blank column beside Thomas's name now filled, a small ink drawing added in the margin. A bird with its beak bound shut. The meaning of that symbol, like all the others, stayed locked within their circle. Whatever they believed the act had accomplished, it was clear that the family's cycle had not been broken after all. It had merely paused, as if to remind the village that the pattern was not bound by chance, but by choice. And choice, when it hides behind the mask of care, can wait as long as it needs to for the next opportunity. It was in the damp autumn of 1870, during the brief months when the Kindred manor stood in the possession of strangers, that the ledger emerged. The new owner, a railway investor from Bristol, had been overseeing the cataloging of the estate's furniture when an appraiser noted the weight of a writing desk did not match its size. The desk was old oak, worn smooth in places where generations of hands had leaned, but the lowest drawer would not slide fully out. A thin blade and a few minutes' work revealed a false bottom, and beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a leather-bound book darker than any of the house's other volumes. Its edges were stiff with age, the binding scarred as though fingernails had worked at it in moments of thought or hesitation. The pages inside were lined with names, each one a kindred boy, each written in a hand that shifted subtly over the years yet never left the family. Dates of birth stood in the left column, death in the right, and between them the span of years never exceeded 12. No cause of death was recorded, only a symbol drawn in black ink beside each name. Some were simple, a bird with clipped wings, a jar containing something coiled and indistinct, a key turned upside down. Others were more intricate, a flower with its petals neatly severed, a candle snuffed mid-drip, a small fish split cleanly from head to tail. The drawings were precise, almost delicate, as if the hand that made them understood that meaning could be hidden more securely in pictures than in words. The earliest entries were the faintest, their ink faded to brown, but the care in their arrangement never wavered. Each name and date aligned perfectly with those before it, as though the act of recording was as important as the act it represented. The book did not speak in explanations, but in repetitions, each mark a token of a deed already carried out. To an untrained eye, the ledger might have looked like some private memorial, the work of a grieving archivist preserving the memory of lost children. But the pattern was too exact, the imagery too consistent to be mourning alone. It had the cold order of a record kept not for remembrance but for accounting, a list of tasks fulfilled and marked complete. The jar, always drawn with something floating in its center, appeared most often beside boys who had died in winter, suggesting a preservation of some kind. The clipped-wing bird marked those who had vanished from public sight days before their official death date, their bodies buried before dawn. The upside-down key belonged to deaths labeled as accidents, perhaps signifying that a door had been locked against escape. Whether these were codes for methods, locations, or something deeper, the connection was undeniable. Each boy's final day was not left to chance, but mapped in a language passed down like an heirloom. The handwriting changed every few decades, shifting subtly with the style of the time, but always the same controlled pressure, the same measured spacing, as though each new keeper had been trained by the last. There were no flourishes, no hesitations in the ink, the kind of hand that did not waver because it had rehearsed each mark long before it touched the page. Whoever wrote in this book did so without fear of discovery, confident that its hiding place would keep it safe until it was needed again. When the railway man's interest in the manor faded and the estate returned to distant kindred cousins, the ledger vanished once more. The false bottom in the desk was repaired and the story of its finding dissolved into rumor among the staff who had handled it. Yet the memory of the pages lingered for those who had turned them. The strange certainty that each symbol was more than a mere drawing, that it was a seal on an act carried out with precision. In the years that followed, the names continued, though no outsider saw where they were written. Somewhere in the house, the ledger remained ready for its next entry, its next mark in ink, its next quiet claim to a life that had never been meant to reach beyond 12. Eleanor Kindred was born in the winter of 1843, a year when the orchard bloomed out of season and the village midwife swore the air in the manor felt unnaturally still. From the beginning she was set apart, a child whose curiosity reached into places others would not look. While other girls learned needlework and hymnals, Eleanor studied anatomy sketches her uncle kept locked in a cabinet, memorizing the fine lines of muscle and bone. In her 20s, she left Hallowford for London, training as an anatomist's assistant under the guise of improving her education. In truth, she was learning to take the human body apart with precision, reducing it to systems she could map, control, and if she wished, stop. When she returned to the manor a decade later, she brought with her crates of foreign instruments, their steel gleaming in shapes not seen in the parish before. Delicate hooks, rib spreaders, scalpels curved like talons, and slender syringes wrapped in soft leather cases. She kept these tools in a locked room on the east wing, along with glass specimen jars ordered from France, each filled with a pale, preserving liquid that held things the household staff learned never to name. A boy's small hand, its nails neatly trimmed, a section of rib, smooth and white as porcelain, the top joint of a finger suspended as if waiting to be rejoined to the whole. Servants whispered about them in the kitchen, but none would dare touch the locked door, for Eleanor's presence had a weight that silenced questions. In the village, she maintained the kindred image of composure, attending services, donating to the poor, even mending clothes for orphans. Yet behind her eyes was the measuring gaze of someone who saw flesh as a series of parts to be managed. Her journals, written in the same careful hand that marked the family ledger, revealed the doctrine that guided her. Halt the maturation of the seed-bearer before corruption takes root. The phrase appeared again and again, sometimes underlined, sometimes followed by diagrams of the male reproductive system, annotated with precise instructions for removal, tying, or crushing of certain structures. She described her work as preservation, the prevention of a sickness she believed lay dormant in all kindred men, a sickness that would awaken if allowed to reach full manhood. She called it the rot of the patriarch, an inherited flaw of spirit that could only be stopped by ending the vessel before it spread. The deaths of the boys during Eleanor's tenure were not the sudden fevers or accidental drownings of earlier years. They bore marks invisible to the casual mourner but obvious to the eye of anyone who had studied the body. A missing tendon here, a certain gland excised there, internal structures cut with surgical neatness before burial. The coffins were sealed quickly, and the parish continued to write natural causes with the same quiet efficiency as before. To those who suspected, there was no proof, only the knowledge that the changes to the bodies had purpose. They were not random mutilations, but alterations, procedures performed with the care of someone shaping the outcome of a specimen. Neighbors remembered seeing deliveries at odd hours, crates unloaded from coaches marked with the names of medical suppliers in Paris and Lyon. They recalled the way Eleanor handled the glass jars, tilting them to catch the light, inspecting each preserved piece as if confirming it still told her the truth she needed to hear. Children said she smelled faintly of camphor and iron when she passed them in the lane. None dared speak to her of the deaths, for her reputation was shielded by her intelligence, her charitable acts, and the quiet terror she inspired. In the orchard where generations of kindred boys had walked, Eleanor often strolled alone at dusk, her gloves spotless, her gaze fixed on the horizon as though she were measuring the slope of the land. She would pause by certain trees, her fingers brushing the bark before turning back toward the manor. Those who saw her in these moments said she seemed satisfied, as if each death had not been an end but a successful completion of some private experiment. Under her watch, the family's methods became sharper, more deliberate, the pattern of loss continuing with a precision that left no room for chance. And as the next boy reached his 12th year, the locked room on the east wing stood ready, its tools polished, its jars lined in perfect rows, waiting for the work she believed must always be done. In the winter of 1894, the Kindred manor stood sealed against the wind, its windows shuttered, its chimneys trailing the thin smoke of a house that slept lightly. Samuel Kindred, not yet 12, had been kept indoors for weeks under the pretext of a lingering cough. The boy was quiet by nature, a watcher rather than a talker, and the family's constant attention to his every movement felt to outsiders like concern. But inside the house, that concern was measured, deliberate, and without warmth. The kind that counted his steps, timed his meals, and ensured he never lingered in any room alone for too long. On the morning he died, Samuel was found lying in his bed as though still asleep. His nightshirt was smooth, the blankets pulled up to his chin, the lamp on his bedside table burned down to a curl of blackened wick. Yet his face was deep purple, the skin around his eyes dark as bruises and his lips slightly parted as if he had tried and failed to draw in one last breath. There was no sign of a struggle, no marks on his skin, no trace of vomit or blood. His body was dry, his hair neatly combed, the pillow beneath his head undisturbed. The village doctor, Thomas Whitaker, arrived within the hour and began his examination with the ease of a man accustomed to sudden endings. But when he opened Samuel's chest, he found the boy's lungs heavy, their spongy tissue replaced in places by a pale, translucent mass that slid beneath his fingers like jelly. Further inspection revealed the substance filling the airways, clinging to the bronchi and sealing them as tightly as wax. It was not fluid and did not smell of disease. Weeks later, after sending samples to a colleague in London, Whitaker learned what it was: rendered animal fat, softened by heat and left to congeal. The finding made no medical sense. There was no wound through which it could have entered. No burns or lesions in the mouth or throat. It was as if the boy had been drowned in something warm and thick, yet not a drop had spilled on his clothes or bedding. Whitaker refused to sign the death certificate. He told the Kindreds that a coroner's inquest would be required, that the presence of such a substance demanded investigation. His refusal was met with silence, the kind that did not ask for explanation but promised consequence. For days afterward, he noticed the manor's women in the village streets, speaking softly to neighbors, standing a little too long outside his surgery as if gauging the traffic that came and went. He began to feel watched, his movements noted, his conversations overheard in the pub. 2 weeks later, in the middle of a windless night, his practice caught fire. By morning it was a blackened shell, the air still bitter with smoke, his medical records and instruments reduced to ash. The cause was never proven, though villagers whispered that the blaze burned too hot and too clean to be an accident. Samuel was buried that same day. His coffin was closed before even the vicar could look upon his face, and the entry in the parish register read only "natural causes." Those who saw the pallbearers carry the box down the manor steps said it seemed strangely light, though none dared wonder aloud why. The oddest detail, remembered only years later, was that on the night before his burial, the kitchen chimney had poured thick smoke for hours, carrying with it a faint, greasy smell that clung to the orchard for days. Whether it came from cooking or from the quiet destruction of something that should never have been found, no one asked. And in the weeks that followed, the manor's routines resumed, unbroken, as though Samuel's life had ended exactly when and how it was meant to, and the method, unnatural, careful, and entirely without trace, had been perfected for reasons known only to those who had prepared it. Between 1900 and 1910, The Kindred manor stood oddly quiet in one regard. No birth cries of boys echoed through its halls. Parish records showed christenings for daughters, nieces, and cousins, but not a single male child entered the register. In a family where the death of every son by 12 had become as predictable as the seasons, the absence of new candidates was unsettling. Not to the village, which regarded it as a stroke of divine reprieve, but to the women within the house, whose correspondence from the time carried an undertone of impatience, even frustration. Letters passed between the surviving kindred matriarchs, and distant relations spoke of restoring the balance and the continuation of our responsibility. Some exchanges with relatives in other counties hinted at discreet arrangements, offers of financial support in exchange for the adoption of male infants who could be presented as legitimate heirs. The tone was never affectionate. The boys were not described as children, but as necessities. The search was clinical, persistent, and without pause. A widow in Devon was approached twice in the same year. A distant cousin in Yorkshire was offered a stipend to entrust her son to better care. No arrangement held. Prospects vanished, withdrew, or, in one documented case, died suddenly before the transfer could take place. The women of the manor spoke little of these failed attempts, but their ledgers, still carefully maintained, bore empty columns waiting to be filled, as if space had been reserved for names not yet known. It was not until 1911 that their efforts bore fruit. A boy named Jonathan was born to a young kindred cousin and his wife, both frail from illness. Within weeks, he was brought to the manor under the guise of offering him a stronger upbringing. His arrival was treated as an event of rare importance. The nursery, unused for over a decade, was restored to immaculate order, and the boy was dressed in fine linens, fed on the richest cream, and examined daily as though each stage of his growth were a matter of urgent study. From the outside, Jonathan's life appeared charmed. He was never left unattended, never allowed to wander beyond the orchard walls, never shown anything that might exhaust or distress him. Visitors saw a beloved child treasured after too many years of absence. Yet the watchfulness that surrounded him was not born of love, but of control. Every meal was weighed, every garment inspected before he wore it, every movement of his developing body quietly noted. The women's conversations often paused when he entered the room, their eyes tracking him with the calm concentration of collectors, ensuring a rare specimen remained intact. To Jonathan, the manor was the world, and its stillness was normal. When he reached his 12th year, the atmosphere in the house shifted almost imperceptibly. The visits from the village doctor became less frequent, while the midwife, an older woman with long-standing ties to the family, began appearing at the manor without public announcement. The boy was told he was to rest more often to avoid running, to conserve his strength for the next season. In March of that year, Margaret Kindred, then the household's matriarch, summoned the midwife to the manor under cover of night. Jonathan was sedated with a draught that left him breathing shallowly but without pain. While he slept, every tendon in his legs was severed with surgical precision, ensuring he would never again stand or walk. He did not wake fully from the sedation. Instead, he was carried to a small, locked attic room, its single window shuttered, its bed prepared with fresh sheets and a folded blanket at the foot. Margaret left a note for the midwife, written in her fine, even script. "Leave him to sleep in peace." The door was locked from the outside. The following afternoon, the midwife left the manor with an envelope of payment and eyes that would not meet those of the servants. Jonathan's death was announced 2 days later, attributed to a sudden fever in the night. No one saw his body carried down from the attic. The village grieved politely, reassured by the sight of Margaret at the funeral, her expression calm, her hands steady as she accepted condolences. Inside the house, the empty nursery was closed once more, its curtains drawn, its shelves stripped of toys. The ledger in the study gained a new entry. Jonathan's name, his dates of birth and death, and beside them a small ink drawing of a ladder with its rungs broken clean through. The space for the next boy lay waiting just below, blank but inevitable, the women of the family already turning their thoughts to where he might be found. The war years gave the Kindreds what they had not enjoyed for generations: cover. Between 1914 and 1918, the deaths of several Kindred boys were recorded as military accidents, their names etched into the parish memorial alongside those who had truly fallen in France and Belgium. On paper, the stories fit the times: a munitions mishap, a training exercise gone wrong, a transport convoy overturned in bad weather. Yet the military rosters told a different truth. The boys had never been deployed, some not even formally enlisted. Their files bore the faintest of pencil notations, dates and units crossed out, as if someone had gone back later to make the records align with a story already chosen. No bodies were returned. No comrades wrote letters of condolence. The Kindred women wore black, accepted the solemn handshakes at the church door, and never once allowed the caskets to be opened. In a season when so many households grieved, theirs did not stand apart. By 1925, the manor no longer carried the gleam it once had. The orchards had grown wild at the edges, weeds threading between the rows where children once dared not play. The eastern wing stood unlit most nights, its windows dulled with dust. Roof tiles slipped in winter storms and were left unrepaired until whole patches of sky showed through in the attic. The family's wealth had thinned, though never enough to make them desperate. They lived within their means, selling parcels of land on the outskirts, closing off rooms they no longer used, retreating deeper into the heart of the house. In the village, the Kindreds became a rarer sight. They no longer hosted the harvest feasts or sat in the front pew at services. Groceries were delivered to the gate rather than fetched in person. Their absence became normal, their silence part of the landscape. The pattern, the unbroken sequence of boys dead by 12, was known now only to a handful of villagers old enough to have seen it themselves. They did not speak of it to outsiders, not because they had forgotten, but because they believed that speaking it aloud could invite it nearer. When the subject crept into late-night conversation at the public house, it was always smothered quickly, replaced with talk of crops or weather. For those who remembered, the knowledge was like an heirloom too dangerous to pass on. Better to let the younger generation think the Kindreds were merely odd, and not a family shaped around a blade. And yet the orchard betrayed them. On certain nights, without warning, black smoke would rise from its center, thick enough to blot the moon and smell of something other than wood. The fires came most often in the months after a boy's 12th birthday, though the timing was never exact enough for certainty. No one dared approach when it happened. The sight of that dark column twisting into the sky was enough to keep doors bolted and curtains drawn. Some said the smell carried the tang of burning meat. Others swore they saw shapes, small, unrecognizable, hanging for a moment in the heat before collapsing into ash. By morning the smoke was gone and the orchard lay still, the ground at its heart disturbed as though something had been buried or burned away entirely. In a place where war had taken so much, it was easy for such things to pass without notice from authorities. The nation had been broken open, its attention fixed on rebuilding. In the quiet margins of that chaos, the Kindreds continued their work, unobserved, unchallenged, and increasingly invisible. Their secrecy had been perfected to the point where no one could say with proof what they had seen, only what they feared. And in Hallowford, fear was enough to keep the truth from ever reaching beyond the orchard's edge. In the summer of 1952, the government sent a man to Hallowford whose job it was to read what others overlooked. Arthur Clements was a health inspector trained to follow numbers where they led. His assignment was simple on paper. Review rural mortality rates, note anything that might suggest hereditary disease or environmental hazard. Hallowford's parish records were unremarkable at first glance. Yet the further back he read, the more the names repeated, the more the dates compressed into a rhythm that had no business existing outside a ledger of executions. The Kindreds dominated the registers, their boys dying with the same unnerving precision that defied any known illness. Clements marked them in his notebook, tracing the pattern across a century and a half, until the page looked less like a list of deaths and more like the measured spacing of teeth on a saw. Curiosity sharpened into something heavier when he reached the war years. In 1941, a boy named Daniel Kindred had died at 12, supposedly of a sudden wasting fever. Clements noted the speed of the burial and the lack of any doctor's certification. The entry carried the same hand as so many others before it. Neat, steady, and without the smallest flicker of uncertainty. He petitioned for an exhumation, framing it as a check for environmental toxins that might still threaten the living. The request, to his quiet surprise, was granted, though no one from the village offered to help. They looked past him in the street, spoke of the weather, and kept their doors half shut when he passed. On an overcast evening in late September, he supervised the opening of Daniel's grave. The coffin emerged in good condition, its wood darkened but intact. When the lid was pried up, Clements expected decay. The fragile ruin of a child's body returned to soil. Instead, he found something deliberate. The form inside was not a corpse in the natural sense, but a carefully preserved anatomical shell. The skin, pale and faintly waxy, held its shape with an unnatural firmness. The torso had been opened and resealed with such precision that the seam was barely visible beneath the clothing. Inside, where organs should have been, lay smooth stones wrapped in oilcloth, each parcel tied with cord as though intended for storage. They had weight, balance, and purpose, though no sane purpose could be named. The face was untouched, eyes closed in the manner of peaceful sleep, hair neatly combed. The hands were folded across the chest, though when Clements brushed the cuff back from one wrist, he saw stitching there too. Fine, almost invisible, the kind used by museum preparators to close an incision. There was no odor of rot, only a faint tang of something chemical, dry and sharp, as if the body had been treated to last far longer than any ordinary burial would allow. This was not a child laid to rest. It was an object, crafted with the care of someone for whom the body was not an end, but a medium. The men assisting him worked in silence. One crossed himself. Another muttered that it was best not to touch anything more. Clements recorded every detail in his notes, each line feeling less like an inspection and more like a confession he might one day regret writing. As the light faded, he ordered the coffin closed. The wood sealed with nails, the earth returned to its place, the stone reset as though nothing had been disturbed. But the image would not leave him. The absence inside the boy, the alien weight of those wrapped stones, the sense that the body had been altered to serve a ritual older than any law. He left Hallowford before the first frost. His final report made no mention of Daniel Kindred or the exhumation, citing only no actionable findings and continued monitoring advised. Within the year, he resigned from government service, officially for reasons of ill health. Those who knew him in later years recalled that he never married, rarely traveled, and kept the curtains drawn even in daylight. He avoided conversations about rural England altogether, yet once, after too much drink, was heard to say that some graves were not meant to be opened, not because of what they held, but because of what they proved. In Hallowford, the Kindreds lived on, their orchard undisturbed, their ledgers no doubt gaining new names, each destined to be as hollow and as carefully arranged as the boy Clements had found on that dim September evening. By 1979, the Kindred name had thinned to its last direct branch. The orchard had gone half wild, the manor's windows dulled by decades of dust, and the rooms that once held a dozen voices stood in stillness. Only one direct male heir remained. Michael, 12 years old, the son of Agnes Kindred. Agnes was a figure the village knew more by rumor than by sight, a tall, pale woman who seldom left the estate, whose rare appearances at the grocer or post office were marked by her silent, deliberate movements. She was spoken of with the respect people reserve for something that feels untouchable. Michael was the only child anyone had seen on the grounds in years, a quiet boy with dark hair, never without his mother's watchful presence a few paces behind. On the morning of his 12th birthday, the manor seemed more alive than it had in decades. Lamps burned in rooms long kept dark, and a delivery cart brought parcels wrapped in brown paper. Agnes moved through the kitchen and dining hall with the same precision as someone setting a stage, arranging cutlery in perfect alignment, smoothing each crease from the tablecloth. The guest list was small. Family only, though no one could say who exactly still fit that category. By nightfall, every door was locked from within, curtains drawn, and the house's glow was swallowed by the orchard's shadow. No music or laughter drifted to the lane. Whatever passed for celebration inside the Kindred walls happened in silence, concealed from any witness. The next morning, the servants found Michael's bed empty. The covers lay smooth as if no one had slept there, the pillow untouched. His window was shut tight and latched from the inside. No footprints marked the frost on the sill, and no doors had been unlocked overnight. Agnes was in the breakfast room, seated at the head of the table, her teacup resting untouched before her. She made no mention of her son's absence, nor did she answer when asked if he had risen early. Instead, she ordered the staff to attend to the orchard fence, claiming a storm had loosened its boards. Later that day, while inspecting the orchard's edge, a gardener noticed a patch of soil in the inner grove that was darker and softer than the ground around it. The earth had been turned recently, shallow, hasty, yet deliberate. Word reached the village constable, who came quietly, without alerting Agnes. The pit, no deeper than a child's coffin, was dug open with careful hands, but it yielded no body. Instead, at its center lay a single small iron key, rusted with age, and beside it, a lock of dark hair bound tightly with red thread. The thread was knotted 3 times, the kind of knot that resists both accident and decay. The constable turned the items over in his palm, unsure whether they were relics, warnings, or both. No search was made beyond the orchard. No hounds were brought, no neighbors questioned. Those who might have pressed the matter remembered the old pattern and decided quietly that the boy was already beyond saving. In the parish register, no death was recorded for Michael Kindred, but his name never appeared again in school rolls or village gatherings. It was as if he had been erased in a single night, leaving only those 2 objects as proof he had ever lived. The key and the hair vanished from official keeping within days. The constable retired early the following year, telling a friend that there were matters in Hallowford best left buried. Agnes continued to live alone in the manor, her presence in the village shrinking further until she was seen only through the glass of her carriage. She never spoke Michael's name again. In the orchard, the shallow pit's disturbed soil settled back into the rows, indistinguishable from the rest, save for those who remembered where to look. For the Kindred family, the cycle had ended, at least in blood. Michael was the last direct male heir, and with his disappearance, the centuries-old ledger of deaths found no new entry. Yet the absence of a body, the deliberate placement of the key and the knotted hair, suggested that the end was not an accident or mercy, It was an act carried out with the same precision, the same hidden ritual that had marked every boy before him. Only now, the purpose of the act, and whatever the key was meant to open, remained locked in the silence Agnes carried to her grave. In 1993, after years of neglect, the Kindred Manor was sold to a development firm with plans to restore it into a heritage property. The house had been empty for decades, its windows clouded with dust, its roof sagging, the orchard choked by ivy. Contractors moved cautiously through the east wing, where the walls felt colder and the air carried a faint sourness that paint could not hide. During demolition, a carpenter struck plaster that rang hollow. Behind it lay a narrow seam too precise to be structural. The section of wall was opened, and beyond it, in the dim glow of a work light, stood a room no one had known existed. The air inside was dry but close, and the smell was not quite dust. Something faintly metallic, faintly organic, as if time had sealed in the breath of its last occupants. Against the far wall sat 23 child-sized chairs arranged in a perfect semicircle. Each was painted a dull cream, the paint chipped with age, but they were intact, unbroken. On each chair rested a single personal item, a scuffed leather shoe, a cap with its lining worn thin, a carved wooden toy with one wheel missing. Beneath each chair, carved directly into the floorboards, was a date. The sequence was steady, spanning more than a century, each date aligning with the 12th year of a Kindred boy's life. The room was not a place of accident. It was a gallery of endings. The floor between the chairs was stained a deep, uneven black, the wood warped slightly as though it had absorbed something long ago. The shape of the stain was not random, darker in a circle at the center, feathering outward in streaks like spokes. It was here that a central table stood, small and square, its surface marked with faint indentations where something had been pressed repeatedly into the wood. On the table lay a ledger, its cover cracked, its pages yellowed to the color of old teeth. Inside, each boy's name was written in the same careful script, paired with the date carved beneath his chair. The third column was labeled termination, followed by a brief method noted in clinical detachment. Lungs sealed, veins drained, seed excised. There was no apology in the language, no suggestion of crime. In the opening pages, a longer entry explained the purpose of the record. The writer, unnamed but clearly a matriarch, described the kindred male seed as carrying the rot of the patriarch, a flaw both physical and moral that, if allowed to mature, would doom the world beyond repair. The deaths were described not as killings, but as protections, necessary acts to keep the bloodline from poisoning the future. There was a strange reverence in the phrasing, as though the writer believed she was performing a service not just for her family, but for all mankind. Each act was justified as halting corruption before it blooms, a phrase repeated across decades in identical handwriting. It was not the ledger alone that chilled those who found it, but the scale of the preparation. The room had been maintained over generations, each chair clearly placed with care, each personal item preserved as if it held some essence of the boy it belonged to. The air was still, yet the workmen swore they could feel the weight of something watching from the corners. One described it later as standing inside a thought so complete that it had no space for doubt. Even the dust seemed to settle in the same deliberate order as the rest of the room. The discovery was reported, but the ledger and its contents never reached public archives. The developers sealed the chamber within a week, citing structural instability as the reason for its closure. The items on the chairs vanished into private hands, their fate unknown. In the village, whispers began again, though no one could say if the room's existence had been entirely secret or if it had simply been ignored for so long that it had become invisible. What was left behind in that hidden chamber was not evidence of madness in the frenzied sense, but of a mind that had built its cruelty like a craft, consistent, ordered, and convinced of its necessity. It was the logic of evil wearing the calm face of duty, the kind that did not act in anger but in adherence to a plan so ingrained it had outlived its creators. And as the wall was sealed once more, hiding the semicircle of chairs and the black-stained floor, the ledger's words lingered in those who had read them, heavy with the suggestion that the protection the Kindreds believed they offered was not finished, only paused, waiting for someone to take up the work again. By the early 2000s, the Kindred name had shifted from whispered village cautionary tale to something dissected in academic journals and late-night crime documentaries. Historians approached it as folklore, criminologists as a pattern of homicide concealed in plain sight. Researchers traced the deaths back more than 2 centuries, laying the timeline bare in neat graphs and annotated footnotes. Yet for all the data, the core remained the same as it had always been. No trial, no convictions, no confession. Official records still spoke in the language of fever, accident, and misadventure. What had been lived as grief was recorded as inevitability. The cruelty lay not only in the acts themselves, but in how perfectly they were hidden inside the shape of care. The renewed attention unsettled Hallowford. People who had grown up with the orchard as an unremarkable backdrop now found themselves fielding questions from journalists and graduate students about the curse. Some refused to speak at all. Others offered careful fragments as if testing the air for consequence. It was during this period that a memorial stone appeared in the churchyard, its inscription plain: "For the lost sons." There were no names, no dates, no acknowledgement of how or why they were lost. It was less a monument than a pressure valve, something the village could point to when outsiders pressed too hard, a way to honor without truly admitting. At its base, flowers appeared regularly, but never with cards. The influence of the story reached beyond memory into law. In quiet meetings at the county level, officials agreed on a safeguard. From that point forward, every child's death would require examination by an independent medical officer, with no exceptions for family physicians or local coroners. The measure passed without debate, its necessity understood but never openly discussed. No one in the chamber spoke the Kindred name, yet it was the unspoken presence in the room, the reason the law was written at all. It was a rule meant to ensure that whatever had happened in that family could never happen again. Or at least not without leaving a mark that could be seen. Still, the orchard remained. Overgrown now, its outer rows collapsing into bramble, it sat behind its leaning fence like something abandoned but not forgotten. Locals said the air inside it was different, heavier, the way a room feels after an argument that never truly ended. Children dared one another to cross its boundary, to walk the rows where so many Kindred boys had once played under watchful eyes. Few stayed long. Even in daylight, the silence inside seemed to press against the ears. Some claimed to hear the faint crack of branches with no wind, or to catch the smell of smoke when the air was still. The documentaries lingered on such details, filming the orchard in long, static shots, letting the quiet speak. Academics debated whether the rot of the patriarch written in the Kindred ledger was delusion, superstition, or a code for something more tangible: abuse, disease, a hereditary condition twisted into ideology. In every theory, the same unease persisted: the scale of it, the discipline required to carry it out for generations without error. It was one thing to imagine a single act of cruelty. It was another to see it repeated with the patience of ritual. Masked so completely by the trappings of family life that no one with authority ever broke the silence. In the end, the public moved on, as it always does. The documentaries became old news. The journal articles faded into academic archives, and Hallowford returned to the pace it had kept for centuries. But in the shadow of the churchyard memorial and the tangle of the orchard fence, the truth lingered in the same form it always had. Not proven, not punished, but known. The Kindred legacy was not a curse in the supernatural sense. It was a choice, repeated over lifetimes, sustained by the belief that it was necessary. And belief, when it is strong enough, leaves a mark deeper than law, deeper than memory. It becomes the soil itself, waiting for someone to plant in it again. The Kindred story ended not with an arrest or a trial, but with the slow fading of a name that had once held sway over an entire parish. The deaths endured for centuries because they were wrapped in the fabric of what passed for loyalty, sealed inside the rituals of family life. The same hands that braided hair, mended clothes, and set a child's place at the table were the ones that prepared his final hour. The same voices that read bedtime prayers also wrote his death into a ledger. From the outside, it looked like tradition, the quiet respectability of a family guarding its own. But inside, it was a design that fed on obedience, and that obedience kept it alive. Evil of this kind does not roar or bare its teeth. It whispers, it smiles. It serves tea while deciding which life will be allowed to grow and which will be protected from reaching its imagined corruption. The Kindred's power was not brute force, but control of the story, deciding what was told, what was hidden, and when the truth would be covered by another burial. They did not need to convince the world of their innocence. They only needed to convince their neighbors that silence was safer than the questions that would follow. Fear and loyalty blurred until they were one and the same, and those who suspected learned that survival meant stepping lightly around the orchard and the women who walked its rows. Today, the orchard is a tangle of bramble and leaning trees. Its neat lines collapsed into a maze. The manor stands hollow, the air inside smelling of damp wood and old stone. Wallpaper curls from the walls, and the east wing, the one no outsider ever entered, is sagging into itself, its locked doors long since warped shut. No official plaque marks the place as anything more than a ruin, but the soil beneath it still holds the memory of what was done there, and the ledger, whether lost, destroyed, or kept in some private drawer, remains a testament to how far the mind can go when it convinces itself that cruelty is not only justified but necessary. The pattern was never random. It was calculated, ritualized, and carried out with the same precision one might give to tending a garden. Each death fit neatly into the one before it, a continuation of a single decision made long ago and reinforced until it became law inside the family. Love was the mask, but preservation was the weapon. The idea that it was a curse was convenient, a story that allowed outsiders to pity rather than suspect, to speak of tragedy rather than murder. Yet the truth, stripped of its superstition, looks far more deliberate. If the curse existed at all, it was the curse of belief, the ability to inherit not only land and name, but the conviction that ending a life could be an act of care. Whether the Kindreds were acting under shared delusion or cold intent, the result was the same. The curse did not simply fade when the last male heir vanished. It ended because there was no one left to fit the pattern, no more columns in the ledger waiting to be filled. And still, the question remains, unanswerable but heavy. Was this the most successful hidden serial killing in British history? The statistics suggest it could be. No charges, no discovery during its lifetime, no public reckoning. Just the long, clean line of deaths that no one in power ever chose to break. That is why the story still disturbs. It is not only about what happened, but about how it could happen for so long without resistance. It asks what might be living under similar masks right now in other houses, behind other hedges, in families whose respectability makes them untouchable. It reminds us that evil need not be violent in its appearance to be total in its effect. It can move quietly through generations, handed down like an heirloom, surviving on the silence of those who benefit from its order. The Kindreds are gone, but the shape they left behind, the method, the discipline, the unbroken calm, could take root anywhere. And so the question hangs, not as a warning, but as a possibility. What do you think? Could this happen again?